Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the adventures and the travels of Marquette and Joliet, which happened in the year 1673, about 40 years after Nicolet made his way to what we now call Green Bay. The French were very interested to see how much further the waterways went that Nicolet found, and but they decided upon Marquette and Joliet to do this expedition because they had heard from the native indigenous contacts there about a waterway that could lead to the Salt Sea. So, who were Joliet and Marquette? Well, Louis Joliet began as a philosophy student and made his way to Canada and got himself into the fur trade and was known as a pretty good fur trader. But he really made his mark as a map maker. And it made a lot of sense to have the best map maker you could find to go into unexplored territory. You got to remember, ladies and gentlemen, this was well before Google Earth or anything of that nature. So Joliet was the map maker in the team. Father Marquette, Jacques Marquette, was a Jesuit priest, or a black robe, as the indigenous called him. And besides being a very holy and friendly fella, he had also spoke several languages. He spent about 7 years in Canada and had an aptitude for picking up the different tribes' languages. So the combination of Father Marquette and the map making of Joliet made for a pretty powerful team. And they took off along the same route that Nicolet had 39 years earlier, and they traveled in birch bark canoes along with 5 other men. And they came along Lake Michigan into Green Bay, again made contact with the Potawatomi and Winnebago indigenous tribes. And they had a couple of guides lead them as far along the Fox River as they could. And they came upon what today is called portage, or portage if you speak the French. And there was an 8 mile stretch from where the Fox River flowed actually north into Green Bay, and what we now call the Wisconsin River flowed south into down into the Mississippi River. So that 8 miles was quite a walk, but they got help to portage across. And then their Winnebago guides said, "We're out of here. You can meet. There's some friendly folks, but we're not going too far." They were a little bit afraid. So Marquette and Joliet made their way along the Wisconsin River, and when they reached the Mississippi, it's near the modern day town they named Prairie du Chien, which in French means prairie of dogs, and they celebrated. It was a big victory to find this Mississippi River that the indigenous people had told them will take them to the salt water. Well, that was just the opening start of their expedition. A couple of days down along the Mississippi, they met with some other indigenous folks, and they received a peace pipe, which later saved their lives. As they continued to map make and make their way along the Mississippi River, where the Arkansas River dumped into the Mississippi, they came across some hostile native people. And what made it unique outside of them being hostile was the fact that not bows and arrows were their weapons, but they had muskets, they had rifles, which meant that these people had European contact, most likely the Spanish. And only Father Marquette's holding the peace pipe above their head kept them from attacking. And once things settled down and they got to discussing, they learned that 10 days south, the Mississippi they would run into both Spanish people and the Gulf of Mexico. And that's where Marquette and Joliet said, "Okay, we're good." They had it on good word that this would lead them to the Gulf of Mexico, and they didn't want to get caught by their Spanish counterparts. Had they been taken captive by the Spanish, they most likely wouldn't have been treated very well. So they turned around and made their way back to Montreal. So this was huge information back in the day for the French, for they learned that they could travel the St. Lawrence River and get into the Great Lakes and only have to portage 8 miles to get to the Wisconsin River to hit the Mississippi, and they can make it all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where at some point in time the French did drive out the Spanish, and that's where New Orleans is today. And the French had a pretty easy access, highway access,